I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. I want to try to understand better what Israel's objectives are and what the current state of the conflict is. We're talking on June 18th in the afternoon, about 2:00 p.m. Eastern. And to do this, I have with us one of the most eminent historians, military historians, scholars that I know, and it's Dr. Elliot A. Cohen, a dear friend and colleague here at CSIS, where he's the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy. And of course, Eliot was the eminent dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He was counselor to Condoleezza Rice. He has been thinking about this issue for a very long time. So Eliot, I want to ask you first, what are Israel's real strategic objectives here? Some say it's regime change, some say it's deterrence. Where do you fall on this?
So in the narrowest sense, it's not about deterrence. This is about destroying the Iranian nuclear program. That's the narrowest objective. And we can talk about what that means, but that's certainly what they intend to do. I think the larger perspective here, though, is very important, which is that the Israelis believe, I think justly, that they've been at war with Iran for a very long time, that entered a particularly intense phase with the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks. There have now been several campaigns that have followed from that, including the campaign that destroyed Hezbollah. And I do believe that this particular episode was triggered by their sense that the Iranians were moving close to actually manufacturing nuclear weapons, which would make sense. Now, I think indirectly the Israelis may be hoping for regime change, but I think that is a secondary objective if they think they can achieve it, and they're not going to do something like an invasion. But I think they are probably calculating, again with some reason, that this may deliver enough of a shock to the regime that you do get a rather different Iranian government at the end of this.
So, Eliot, in a larger sense, you are suggesting that Israel won't go in on the ground to the extent that they aren't already on the ground in some covert way. But you're also talking about that this is going to be prosecuted by the air. Can Israel accomplish what it needs to accomplish by the air? And does it need the United States to help assist with an offensive strike?
Well, it's only partly by the air. There, as you noted, there's very extensive set of covert actions with Mossad, and I wouldn't rule out some very limited ground operation to perhaps attack a particular facility. I think the answer is basically they can do most of it with one very important exception, and that's the Fordo installation, which is very, very deeply buried, and which to take out would probably, I say probably, require the United States dropping the 15-ton GBU-57 very deep penetrator from B-2 bombers, which of course the Israelis don't have. But I think most of their other objectives they actually are achieving. They've effectively destroyed Iranian air defenses. They can bomb anything they want. They have not only done a lot of damage to nuclear facilities, and they will do more, they are also eroding the Iranian ability to strike back at them by hitting a lot of their mobile launchers and some of their fixed sites and storage sites for ballistic missiles. And finally, and not least importantly, they've been engaged in a campaign of targeted killing of senior military leaders and also nuclear scientists. I think the current tally of those is about 14, which is actually a pretty considerable number.
And Eliot, what does this operation really tell us about Israel's military capabilities and intelligence penetration in Iran? This seems like a really high-tech, highly skilled operation. As you mentioned, they have air cover. I want to get into that a little bit in a minute. But what does this tell us about Israel's capabilities?
Oh, it's an extraordinary operation. It's the only thing that we've seen recently that's in any way comparable to it, and that was on a much smaller scale, although tremendously impressive, was the Ukraine spiderweb attack on Russian strategic bombers. But this is on a much bigger scale over very long distances. I think everybody knew that they had a very good Air Force. I think, once again, people were somewhat surprised by the degree of intelligence penetration they had on Iran, this is something the Israelis have been working on for decades. And the thing is, they have seen the Iranian nuclear program as a genuinely existential threat. That's a phrase that people toss around rather loosely. But the fact is that when you think that your existence is genuinely at stake, you put an enormous amount of effort into figuring out how to deal with the people who are, out to destroy you. And that's what the Israelis have done, and they have formed on that one. So it's an extraordinary performance. Are people shocked that the Israelis are capable of it? Probably not, but it's still remarkable and in some ways surprising.
Elliot, is that a widespread view in Israel? Israel's polarized just like, the United States and other countries are polarized politically and by issue. Is it a widespread view in Israel that Iran cannot achieve a nuclear weapon, that there needed to be an intervention by Israel?
Yeah, I think on this one there's something much closer to consensus, the kind of consensus that you had immediately after October 7th. Where there's been polarization over Gaza, it's been over, are you willing to stop the fighting in order to get hostages back if that is indeed possible? But I think the Israelis have come to the conclusion that the Iranians really are out to get them, that this is a genuinely existential threat. So it's no coincidence that even some of Prime Minister Netanyahu's most vociferous critics, including people like Yoav Gallant, the former Minister of Defense, have come out in favor of this. I mean, I think, pretty strong consensus there. By the way, one other thing that is somewhat unexpected, I think, even on the Israeli side, is on the whole, they've done a remarkable job of limiting the Iranian ability to strike back. I mean, the Iranians have fired hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles at them. Only about 20 of them have landed. Now, they've killed about 24 people and wounded hundreds more. But the Israelis, to my understanding, were expecting to take much heavier blows than that. And they were able to prevent that with a series of preemptive attacks on launchers and missile storage, but also some very clever attacks on the leadership personnel who would have to order and coordinate those strikes. So they've been able to hold the damage to themselves down really in quite a remarkable way.
But it doesn't mean that Israel's not feeling that damage, correct? I mean, we've seen, fires in Herzliya, we've seen Haifa be bombed, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, of course. It's a scary time to be in Israel. It's a scary time for civilians in Iran as well. What are you hearing from your sources on the ground about how it is actually in Israel right now?
I think less scary than it looks from over here. It, of course, scary. If you're, hunkering down in bomb shelters, it's going to be, and hearing bangs, then it's going to be scary. But let's remember, first, the Israelis are used to that. They've gone through a lot of that. Secondly, the actual damage has been really remarkably limited. Television footage of any particular strike is going to be dramatic and upsetting. But on the whole, this is not a very extensive level of destruction. And above all, important to remember, this is an extraordinarily cohesive society under threat. There are now 100,000 Israelis trying to get back to Israel.
Right.
Now, in most countries, when you're at war and missiles are raining down on your cities, people would be trying to figure out a way to leave. Here, they're trying to figure out a way to get back. And
Right.
people should stop a moment and just think about that.
That's quite something to think about. The morale seems, as you say, to be pretty steadfast and wanting to, get this mission accomplished. What to you would mission accomplished look like for the Israelis?
I think if they can really inflict an extremely high level of damage on the nuclear facilities, and there are, dozens, because there are a lot of different pieces to building nuclear weapons. There's enrichment, there's manufacturing the warhead, there's fitting it to delivery means. There are all kinds of things. I do think taking out Fordo will be part of it, and if we don't do it, they may try to find other ways of doing it. I think for them that's the big success, as well as killing off a substantial chunk of the leadership echelon in Iran. I suspect the Israeli calculation is that this kind of blow, which is extraordinarily humiliating for the Iranians, will trigger some kind of regime event. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is 86. He's not well. A lot of the people who've been killed are from the old generation of the Iran-Iraq War. There's undoubtedly a younger generation. They're sitting on a very hostile population that really hates them and would like to see change. And I think that's what the Israelis are quietly hoping for, that this will be a shock to the system. And it should be a shock to the system. What is it that the Iranian regime had to offer its people? Well, it had, religious zeal and revolutionary spirit. That's gone. It's been replaced by cynicism and hatred of a very corrupt regime. It had imperial ambitions across the Middle East. Well, that's been blown up by losing Hezbollah and by losing Syria as well. Let us remember that. And then actually the nuclear project was a sort of a rally point for Iranian morale. When I worked at the State Department, I had on my desk as a keepsake an Iranian banknote. And if you held that banknote up to the light, you would see that the watermark was the sign of an atom over Natanz,
Really?
one of the main enrichment sites. And that tells you something about how the centrality of the nuclear project to the regime's prestige. But if all that stuff is in ruins, if it's abundantly clear Iranian air defenses are completely incapable of defending the country, the Israelis can fly over that country in daylight now. So what does the regime have left? Answer is the only thing it has left is repression, which it's good at. And that may be able to tamp down the Iranian people. But no regime, even the most totalitarian regime, and Iran is not quite that, can in the long run survive on repression alone. It just doesn't work.
So you mentioned, Elliot, that the Israelis have air supremacy. They can fly into Iran during the day now, even. What does that actually mean? Do they, control what's happening there? Is there, and what are the limits to having air superiority?
Well, it means you can hit whatever you want to hit. Anything that you can hit from the air, they can hit. Now, they can't maintain really persistent presence, although I would even modify that to some extent with some of the very sophisticated drones they have, which are long endurance systems. But basically, it means anything they want to blow up, they can blow up. And that's a very big deal.
Is there a risk that that Israel and the United States, who supplies Israel, could run out of weapons in this conflict?
I don't know. I don't know the weapon stocks they have. Of course it's conceivable, but I think this is one the Israelis have been stocking up for a long time, and it's also clear that the American administration is quite willing to support them and wants to see them succeed in destroying the Iranian nuclear program.
So, Elliot, let's look a little bit into the forward. Do you see a broader escalation across the region, and how might the next phase of an Israeli-Iranian conflict, go forward?
So I actually, conceivably, of course, I mean the Iranians do have a few cards to play, although if they play any of them against the United States, including I think closing the Straits of Hormuz or attempting to, the price they would pay for that would be so high that they won't want to do it, because then I think the United States really would unleash some of the furies on them. I think it's really important to remember that when the Islamic Republic is perfectly capable of backing down, and actually there are a number of occasions on which it has done so. Let me just mention a couple. One is at the very end of the Iran-Iraq War. If you may remember, the United States accidentally shot down an airliner filled with pilgrims coming from Mecca back to Iran. And, at the time, this was an accident. A lot of people in the American government were very concerned that the Iranians were going to unleash terror all over the United States and all over the world. In retrospect, what happened was the Iranians said, "Oh my goodness, the Americans are willing to shoot down civilian airliners. We better kind of bring this war with Iraq to an end," and they did on terms that were very disadvantageous to them. So that's one example. Second example would be The Iranians did suspend their nuclear program for a time in the summer of 2000, spring and summer of 2003. Well, why did they do that? Well, we apparently don't have the full details, but I'd be willing to lay money that they saw what had just happened to their West, namely the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and were afraid a similar thing would happen to them. The third episode, which I remember from my time in government, is we actually had been very reluctant to pick up operatives of the Quds Force, which is sort of the Special Operations Force of the Republican Guard, Revolutionary Guard Corps, rather. But at one point we did. We picked up 5 of them in Erbil, in northern Iraq. What was the Iranian reaction? It was to pull back all of their Quds Force people out of Iraq. So these are not actually people looking to be martyrs, far from it. And I think it is just as likely that they will try to hunker down, see if there's some way they can wriggle out of it. Now there will be a struggle, I suspect, between the real zealots in the regime and a larger majority that just wants this thing to stop. Um, but I think on the whole, it is more likely that they will back off than that they will say, yeah, we want to declare war on the United States as well.
Do you see this leading towards, much more open conflict or stabilizing into a new balance of power?
I think it's reshuffling the cards in the Middle East. And there again, it's part of a number of things that has happened. Actually, beginning with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. One of the reasons why the Israelis can strike at Iran is because the Iraqis don't really control their own airspace. But between the fall of the Saddam Hussein's regime, the destruction of Hezbollah, which is the most important Iranian proxy, the revolution in Syria, which actually deprived them and the Russians of a major base in the Middle East, and now this, you're seeing a kind of a major reorientation of politics in the Middle East, and there are other developments as well. Above all, the rise of a modernizing autocrat in the person of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So I think what the way to think about this is we're watching a reshuffling of the deck. And ultimately, if the Iranian nuclear program really is crushed, and even more so if these events do bring about some kind of internal change in the composition and even nature of the Iranian regime, it's actually much more hopeful, could be a much more hopeful period for the Middle East and the Persian Gulf.
A lot of people are talking about the United States' role in, or lack thereof, in this operation. It's hard to say what the United States is going to do next. The president has not indicated what he's going to do next. What's your biggest worry for the United States if the United States does indeed engage? You mentioned there's always been a fear that Iran would unleash terror on our shores or other American assets around the world. What do you worry about, and what are some of the people who are saying the United States should stay out of it? What are they worried about?
Well, they worry about that, but let's remember the Iranians have unleashed terror all over the world before. They tried to assassinate Donald Trump in
Correct.
2024. They've committed massacres all around the world. Think of the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Argentina. I mean, it's not as though these people have been kind of peaceful and controlled. Far, far from it. Look, I think at the heart of this, a lot of people in the U.S. government, would rather have nothing to do with the Middle East, shift everything to China. I don't think Donald Trump feels that way because he's developed a certain kind of feel for the Persian Gulf in particular. But I think above all, what Trump feels, and in this way, his judgment, I believe, is actually better than that of many of his advisors and many of the nominal experts who are commenting on this, is, one of his great political gifts is he has a feral instinct for weakness. That's what he's really good at sensing. And I think he senses the weakness of the Iranian regime. And so he's willing to press. And actually, as undoubtedly and many of our listeners know, I've been very critical of this administration and of Trump personally. But I think of this, his instincts are correct, and his judgment is better than that of a lot of his critics.
Interesting. Elliot, I want to close with a little bit of a discussion about the Iranian people. Of course, what we're talking about here is the government and not the people. The people are lovely and wonderful people, and Israel's been very careful to try to limit civilian casualties. Like you, I have a ton of Persian friends here in the United States who are saying things like, thank goodness Israel finally did this. Do you see do you feel optimistic that the people of Iran are going to get some relief from this regime, and the Iranian Persian diaspora abroad will get some relief? I know that they're in turmoil right now.
It's certainly much more possible than it was before this kicked off, and I think it is possible. But we just for sure we can't tell. I think in the case of Iran, you need to draw a distinction between the urban middle classes, which are basically inclined to be secular, hostile to the regime, and then the more rural population, which is, as in many countries, more traditional, more devout, and which may not have the same feelings. But the urban population, I think, is hostile to the regime. The critical question is going to be the repressive apparatus. There have been now a number of waves of popular demonstrations in Iran, and they've always been put down brutally, but also with a level of cunning, which you see and you have to notice. The question is that repressive apparatus now going to be shaken and not work? Because if the repressive apparatus stops operating effectively, as has happened in other countries before, then I think you could see very dramatic events quickly. If it's still effective, then the regime will hang on, although it does face this profound succession crisis with the eventual demise of the supreme leader.
Eliot, finally, I just want to ask you, how does this strike, this Operation Rising Lion, compare to Israel's past operations like bombing Osirak in Iraq in 1981 or Syria in 2007?
So, those were one-off, very specialized kinds of things. What's striking here, and this has relevance more broadly for warfare, not just in this case, the very large-scale use of special operations, covert action, that sort of thing, with large-scale precision, long-range precision strike. And that is the angle that I think people interested in the sort of narrower questions of military art and science will want to look at, because other countries will be vulnerable to it. By the way, among them, the United States. It's a lot easier for bad actors from other countries to set up shop here and to do things than it is for us in a lot of other places. But big corrupt countries like Russia and Iran are very susceptible to it because people can get in and out and do things, and we've now seen that. So this is it's a sort of a new chapter in the art of war as well.
Eliot, I can't thank you enough for your insight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.